What is idealism? I should like to reply, thought and love fixed upon essence. If this definition were accepted, idealism would be a leaven rather than a system, because although essence is everywhere present, it never occurs alone, but either as the form of some existing thing or event, or else as a term given in intuition, so that however skeptical or contemplative the philosopher might be, his own existence at least should be a fact, eluding his idealism and prerequisite to it. He could become a complete idealist only by forgetting himself and not inquiring into the origin or meaning of his quite contingent existence and quite arbitrary visions. To rest attention on pure essence and to be an idealist in a moral or poetic sense would therefore be possible to a man holding any system of physics. Even a materialist might be a true idealist if he preferred the study of essence to that of matter or events. But his natural philosophy would keep his poetic ecstasies in their proper place. Such an equilibrium, however, has seldom recommended itself to professed philosophers, whose virtue has impelled them rather to push their favorite insights into the absolute, and assert the universe to be the perfect mirror of their minds. Those who have been idealists by temperament have been accordingly inclined to substitute essence for matter in their theory of the universe. Their hearts, had they not done so, would have been painfully divided. For the most fervent and contemplative idealist is still a man and an animal, and nature has initially directed his attention and passion not on essence, but on fact, on power, on the factors of his material destiny. The more impetuous his idealism, and the more unitary his dogmatic mind, the greater need he will find of fusing his physics with his vision, and assigning to the system of essences which fills his imagination the position and the powers of matter. Hence a Gnostic physics, in which chosen ideas pass for facts and felt values for powers. And it is this superstition, and not the pure study and love of essence, that is commonly known as idealism. The earliest and noblest form of this idealism was the doctrine of the Platonic Socrates. In somewhat playfully defining the current terms of speech, he very earnestly disentangled the types of moral excellence and the goals of political wisdom. His ideas were fundamentally ideals, forms which things would approximate in proportion as they approached perfection, each after its kind. It was in this measure also that things deserved their names and could be justly subsumed under their class in the hierarchy of objects important to the legislator and having fixed functions in the economy of life. Nothing could have a nature unless it had a possible perfection. That which rendered a bed really a bed, or a bridle really a bridle, was their respective functions, for it was as better fitted to sleep in soundly, or to rein in horses effectively, that beds and bridles were better or worse, or were beds and bridles at all. Reality and excellence thus coincided and came from participation in some idea, for this Platonic sort of reality was altogether supernal and had nothing to do with existence. Filth and hair also existed, but unless they found a use and had a consequent standard of perfection, for instance, as fur or as manure, they fell under no idea, and the rational moralist might ignore them. The wise and prudent man was quick to see the ideal in the material, and he prized existence only for the sake of the ever-bright essence of the good which in 1,000 colors and degrees shone darkly through it. This initial phase of Platonism is pregnant with several different possibilities, all of which, perhaps, have not been noticed or developed. In one direction, for instance, it points to supernaturalism, to the conviction that the soul would never find her true good until she was disembodied and identified in contemplation with the ideas which were her natural food. Only in that heaven would there be happiness, where, as in nirvana, there would be no change, no division, and in that sense no existence. For if things draw all their virtue from ulterior perfections which they can only embody imperfectly, evidently it would have been simpler and better to have begun at the end, to have always possessed the good in its perfection, and to have been spared the pain and indignity of alienation from it. This view was actually recommended by the Platonic Socrates in his last hours. Probably at any other time it would have proved embarrassing, and we need not wonder that it remained in abeyance. Had it been pressed, what would have become of that same plebeian wisdom of Socrates, austerely reducing all beauty to health, all virtue to circumspect knowledge, and all good to utility for pleasure? Evidently in heaven there would be no place any longer for beds and bridals, for oogling love, or for the restless yearning to bring all things to birth and beauty. Indeed, it is much to be feared that without those humble natural occasions, and animal functions demanding to be perfected, perfection itself and the good would have entirely vanished. Had the divine sufficiently of the ideas in their own realm been seriously maintained, this supernaturalism, by transcending morality and abolishing preference, would have clearly shown that the foundation of Socratic idealism was material. Matter is indeed indispensable to any system in which the supreme reality is divine and eternal, because without matter that reality could have no manifestation in space, time, persons, and contingent circumstances. This was acknowledged by the Platonists more frankly and intelligently than by modern idealists. Yet while admitting this fundamental function of matter, they represented it as wholly negative and passive, the forms which it took being imposed upon it from above, by the divine virtue of ideas regarded as magnets. This view was protected by two equivocations, on which the whole of Platonizing physics depends. One equivocation consisted in substituting the essence of materiality, itself an idea, for the locally existing and variegated substance of material things. The essence of materiality, being defined by a negation of all forms, was pure non-entity. Its vacuity could be easily proved to contribute nothing to the positive essence of anything, and the bewildered disciple was expected never to perceive that, even if things owed no part of their form to abstract matter, they owed to their concrete matter the possibility of their existence. For if matter was universal inertia, it was also universal potentiality, and by admitting, as ideas do not, a contingent selection and flux of forms, it admitted life, motion, and particular existences, and enabled one idea to manifest itself here and another there in varying degrees of perfection. The other equivocation, intertwined with this, turned on the double use of the word make, for a principle of form makes a thing what it is by justifying its title to a certain name or to a certain estimation, whereas its substance and origin cannot lie there, but must be supplied in the flux of existence by matter predisposed to assume that form, and material agencies at hand, able to impose that possible form upon that special matter. For the material cause of anything is not the essence of materiality, but rather a certain quantity of matter already endowed with form, with local existence, and with internal and surrounding tensions calculated to change its condition. This existing matter in its spontaneous movement is the force at work in the genesis of one thing out of another. Ideas at best can only be the formal or final causes of their exemplification. They are not forces at all, but qualities and harmonies resulting from the concourse of material facts. And to say that the form or function of anything makes it what it is a mere play on the ambiguity of words and a solemn mystification. That the ideas are powerless, and that power is perpetually ascribed to them only by a figure of speech, due to a natural impulse in idealists toward indiscriminate eulogy of whatever is formal and describable, I think may be made evident by a single consideration. Platonic ideas are eternal. Whatsoever hierarchy they may compose, and whatever radiance may issue from them, magically capable of transmuting matter into their likeness. This effluence is perpetual. All the ideas are always equally inviting and potent. Their generous creative virtue pours forth from them impartially at all seasons, in all directions, and to all distances. In a word, they are not physical facts or physical forces at all, but purely logical essences. They are intrinsically without the least bond or the least relevance to any particular point of time or region of space. Whatever magic attraction they may be reputed to exercise over matter, they will exercise over it equally everywhere and at all times. On the other hand, the face of nature is diversified, and the facts that here exemplify those essences are unevenly distributed, often repeated, and almost always imperfect reproductions of their ideal originals. Why, then, is any idea manifested here and not there, perfectly or imperfectly, once, often, or not at all? I know of but one conceivable answer. Because of the different predispositions of the diffuse matter concerned. In respect to any particular event, or to the form of any particular thing or action, the cause of occurrence or non-occurrence can only lie in the material situation at the previous moment, the structure and movement of the substance at hand under those material circumstances. We may rhetorically assign all virtue to the idea then realized, since this is the marvel open to intuition in which alone the spirit is ultimately interested. Yet it was matter that determined whether that virtue should be exercised in any particular case, so that matter alone is responsible for what occurs, although the ideas which it brings to light may get all the credit of it. This predisposition in matter illustrates the fundamental contingency of existence, and in that respect may be likened to absolute free will. We might fancifully say that an absolutely free will in matter was the ground of everything. But such a radical and initial fatality has nothing in it of intelligent freedom, such as appears in actions expressive of the ingrained bent of living creatures. Actions adapted to the circumstances and prophetic of the result which, if fortunate, they are likely to have. Such moral power of self-expression is possible only because that previous fatality or free will in the sense of absolutely groundless action has already established particular psyches and initiated in them an effort towards specific kinds of perfection. At whatever point we call a halt in our backward survey of history, we find extant some arbitrary state of things, determining the forms which intelligent judgment and action shall then assume. A psyche is presupposed distinguishing and declaring good those characters which, were she omnipotent, she would impose on everything. Characters which things will hardly acquire in fact, since many forces besides those centered in the psyche will conspire to shape the issue. Thus, the initiation, distribution, and transmission of existing forms, when traced to their source, are entirely the work of matter. If instead of matter we posit a deity, or a moral force, or a special dialectic to be the first principle of existence, the case is not essentially altered. Such a deity or dialectic or moral force would then be the primal accident, the groundless fact, the one form of being which existence happened to wear in neglect of all other forms, and that which distinguishes matter from essence, its exclusive potentialities, would distinguish that supposed metaphysical agency just as truly and just as arbitrarily, so that in respect to essence and to the clearness and eventual emancipation of spirit, it would be as material a fact as matter ever could be. The question in cosmology is not between matter and ideas, but between one sort of matter and another, and it is for experiment and science, not for logic, to discover what sort of matter it is. This decisive office of matter remains the same when souls are introduced into the Platonic cosmology, where they tend to absorb the ideas and to transpose them into themes or goals of a purely spiritual life. The transformation is indeed glorious. From being mere essences morally relative to the humblest earthly needs and company, the ideas now become spirit shining by their own light, living for themselves and perpetually fulfilling and enjoying their spontaneous destiny. But all this goes on yonder, above in heaven. Here, to souls awakening and painfully struggling on earth, those celestial spirits remain mere ideals, patrons, or models which we may invoke and aspire to imitate. They can be as little affected or moved by us as if they had remained pure essences. Our existence and our vicissitudes are due to an opposite principle. Why indeed did a ray from one of those celestial luminaries fructify in this particular lump of clay and animate me, and not another, with a felt need and an awakening will, aspiring to contemplate and ultimately to possess that and no other heavenly perfection? What called down and buried here in my private animal psyche a seed and replica of that particular celestial spirit? Evidently, again, some predisposition, readiness, or responsiveness peculiar to my earthly substance. Perhaps, if my nature at birth was not due to my material heritage and to the accumulated organization of an endless series of ancestors, it might be attributed, according to a venerable fable, to my own vicissitudes in previous lives. In this case, if my transmigrations had no beginning, my fatal character, or my fatal acts making interruption from moment to moment into my character, must be among the primary free constituents of the universe. They must be factors combining with the other original factors, if any, in determining the flux of existence. We may give these factors a psychological name and call them wills or acts of will. We may even represent them to be conscious or prophetic of an intended result, and we may thus assimilate Platonism to panpsychism or to the world of literary psychology. But if the previous argument be cogent, we shall not thereby avoid an ultimate materialism. The foundations of existence cannot in any case be other than existent, temporal, and arbitrary. Even if the conscious universe were plated together out of the biographies of everlasting souls, dramatically interwoven, the realm of matter would still be their only possible theater. It would establish their conjunctions, fix their dates, measure their journeys, and impose on them, through their bodies, all their providential adventures. Plato, Plotinus, and the Indians never conceived the thing otherwise, and this material underpinning to the migration of souls seems indeed indispensable, if they are to be supposed to communicate and interact as is requisite for all the offices of charity. The material world could hardly be denied, so long as philosophy remained frankly and dogmatically religious. The case is changed, however, when we adopt a strict monadology and ascribe the illusion of society to the moral burden of each separate soul and to its infinite capacity for dreaming. Matter then seems really to vanish from the universe, yet all its blind fertility and mysterious involution has entered into the soul. Whether the spiriting away of materialism in this direction is nominal or real may be discovered by the study of modern idealism. Modern idealism has been in a great measure rooted in psychologism and identical with it. In that measure I have already indicated the surviving materialism on which it leans. But through the transcendental door the Germans long ago abandoned that uninhabitable mansion, and their national idealism may be said to begin where psychologism ends. What then are the relations of this national philosophy to materialism? In the first place, like Platonism, German idealism seems to elude materialism by systematically substituting concepts for substances and descriptions of things for the things themselves. It moves in the plane of ideas and leaves obscured their relation to particular passing facts. Or rather, it reduces this relation to identity, for the choice of concepts and descriptions is no longer dictated by moral preoccupations or spiritual wisdom. It is made in the act of surveying the facts themselves in the spirit of prophecy. Its origin is biblical. Like the Hebrew prophets, Protestant philosophers tend to reject the supernatural and to search nature and history for the divine plan of events. They are prophets not so much in foretelling the future, though, by way of warning, they sometimes venture to do so, as in speaking in the name of the Lord, who is the power in matter, delivering his judgments and magnifying his ways. In contrast to the Platonists, they show the greatest respect for the flux of existence. The ideas or laws which they proclaim and regard as powers are simply tropes supposed to be discernible in that flux. This discernment is inevitably personal and relative, for obviously a moving world where divisions are as fluid as positions is rebellious to any specific essence, even to fixed patterns or laws of change. There may be a dialectic inherent in certain attitudes, but how often does any mind or any revolution obey it? The flux of actual existence is untamably complex, and the tropes visible to the prophet will almost inevitably repeat the outlines of his religious or national passions, his private insights, or his fine pleasure in the inner complications of logic or mathematics. His prophecy or history, seen from a distance, will seem only to have added, by its own novelty, one more to the multitude of unharnessable facts. But let me suppose that he escapes this fatality, and traces, for once, perhaps in the person of Hegel, the exact essence realized in the flux of existence. The idea or master trope enshrined in his system will then be a true summary of all truth. But truth is eternal, neither as a whole nor in any of its parts is it an existence, but only a description of existence. Granting then that the truth had been revealed to the prophetic idealist and that he had described existence on the whole as it actually is, this existence would still, for that very reason, remain outside of his mind and of his description. A description could not be true or superior as knowledge to any rival description, if things of their own accord and in their own persons had not independently exemplified that description and rendered the assertion of it true. Thus, if any descriptive idealism were true, its very truth would imply and posit the natural world, which is the realm of matter, existing in itself, and justifying that description. I believe that many who call themselves idealists take this for granted and have never doubted the substantial existence of nature and society diffused about them. If they protest that materialism is absurd and exploded, they do so only because by matter they understand some pictorial or mathematical idol substituted for the pregnant and unfathomable substance of things. And they would disown their own idealism no less decisively, as a rhetorical idol in its turn, if they understood it to deny the scattered and measurable existence of the natural world. There are, however, a few masters of idealism who despise such a crude philosophy and insist that descriptions are the only knowable facts and descriptive only of their own essence. Being and knowing, they say, are nothing but thinking, and knowledge grows by closer inspection of consciousness, not by information coming from outside or referring to anything ulterior. Very well. This at least is a radical position, yet if we take it consistently, we renounce that claim to truth in our ideas which had originally recommended idealism to the innocent believer. We are abolishing the very notion of truth, and if we retain any system of nature or history, we retain it only as a fashionable mode of thought, a fading dream for the moment entertaining the spirit. Even this pleasing assurance about ourselves that we may create, survive, and develop our absolute experiences would forsake us unless we still asserted with a desperate inconsistency the transcendent validity of memory and expectation, an assertion which reverts to the belief in truth and restores psychologism, if not humanism, with all its materialistic implications. We cannot, in fact, outgrow materialism without outgrowing belief altogether, and unless I am much mistaken, it is restiveness under belief of any sort, because it is a precarious and a check, while it lasts, on spontaneous life, that has inspired all modern or Protestant philosophy. The assertion of a new belief contradicting the old is only a feint in the battle against all dogma. The new belief would prove no less odious, and probably far more absurd, than the old, were it ever seriously established. What its very weakness is a recommendation to a spirit unwilling to be pledged, detesting to be taught, and wedded to nothing but the romantic sport of imposing and deriding its successive illusions. All parties, all ages, Hegel tells us, are mad, yet the folly of all the parts secretly vindicates the rationality of the whole, since every part destroys itself because of its irrationality. Heraclitus of old had said something of the same sort, but that freer and wiser man was not deceived, or bound to deceive others, concerning the principle of this universal instability. It was fire, it was matter, and what, indeed, is this barbarous self-ignorance and self-treason, save the voice of matter, profoundly rebellious to form, and incapable of existing except in the act of leaping from one form to another? Matter, to blind feeling, is but force without, and will within. It seems everywhere instinct with life. Yet life and will are not really possible without a modicum of material organization, stable enough to give foothold and some specific direction to the tentative actions and conquests destined to enlarge it. The paths of life are many, and most of them without issue. Knowledge of nature and of self, in clarifying the blind materialism of action, enlightens this choice of direction, proves it to have been fruitful, and enables it still to be so. The steady habit of matter within, and the psyche, meets and feeds on its steady variations without, and life attains the dignity of the rational animal. Without this definition and character and this recognition of matter, life can only grope and flounder, vehemently agitated by a vague wretchedness, without either courage to confess its limits or lucidity to see its goal. It is therefore by no means necessary that some satirical critic should point out the fundamental materialism of these idealists. It is plainly confessed by their own aspirations. There is nothing for which they manifest a greater contempt than for the merely ideal. They are intent on reality. Reason, life, and ideas, when by definition existent and creative, evidently forfeit their original moral values, for they are no longer essentially fulfillments and perfections desired by that which exists, but its actual nature or cause. They have become, like matter, the primal accident, and this fact is far from lowering them in the estimation of the modern enthusiast. The passion at work in his bosom is the will to live. His idealism expresses his vitality, not any squeamish requirements about the conditions of existence or any sure promises concerning its issue. Why should a few knocks or a great many holocausts chill his ardor in living in God's world? His ancestors hardly required a touch of sardonic piety to be edified by the prospect of almost universal damnation. He may well brace himself in his turn to face the same fatality spread then and distributed impartially throughout the writings of history. And if moral judgment is jeopardized or quite surrendered in this brave optimism, moral sentiment still remains, because the happy adventurer is now convinced that in accepting the universe as it is, and appropriating as much of it as possible, he is partaking in divine life more and more abundantly. I have said that the ideas distinguished by the Platonists were for the most part ideals never realized in this world. They were the sort of tropes interesting to moralists and poets, and essentially forms of the good. But in modern idealism, ideas are meant to be descriptions of the actual course of nature and history. They are alleged laws. Now, the laws of nature are important in considering the means to an end, but they are not ends nor relevant to the choice of ends. For a Platonist, a world governed by natural laws, that is, obeying the habits which it once has formed, would be formless, since its form would not be relevant to the good. It could not become a form of the good until a life arising under those material auspices began to look to it as a condition of its happiness. In many modern idealists, a dose of this Platonism is mixed with their pantheistic and optimistic ethics, but only to the confusion of thought. For when a sentimentalist becomes a historian, or in self-defense a natural philosopher, he insensibly falsifies the facts and laws which actually hold, in order to insinuate others which have an edifying rather than a descriptive value. Yet it is as little philosophical to beautify reality as to be afraid of it. The face of existence, as open to an omnivorously curious mind, is sublime and fascinating enough, but it is surely more than human, less than moral, other than dialectical. It is something like the universe of Spinoza, which, even if stretched a little by his dogmatic logic and idealized by his traditional piety, is essentially the natural world, the realm of matter. This certainly embodies some essence. Spinoza thought it embodied all essences, but the only ideal toward which it moves is that all things shall become what in eternity they are, that nature shall run its course, that every appointed event shall occupy its allotted place, and that opinions shall supersede one another as they do by a psychological and economic necessity. And this is precisely the picture of the universe painted by modern idealists when they are strong-minded. Their idealism adds nothing to Spinoza on the ideal side, rather subtracts, but it adds a transcendental preface showing that this picture is the work of thought, as if that improved it. This pantheism, being Hebraic in origin, sees reality in time rather than in space, and is historical rather than cosmological. And being modern, it approaches reality through the discovery of experience of it, and is fundamentally subjective. But there is no moral idealism left in it, unless it is by making the upshot of history as flattering as possible to local or human interests. In other words, by misrepresenting the truth. This is not to say that pantheism is irreligious. On the contrary, there is a sense in which moral idealism, since it selects, protests, and inspires, is less religious than the unqualified workshop of reality. When the heart is bent on the truth, when prudence and the love of prosperity dominate the will, science must insensibly supplant divination, and reverence must be transferred from traditional sanctities to the naked power at work in nature, sanctioning worldly wisdom and hygienic virtue rather than the maxims of zealots or the dreams of saints. God then becomes a poetic symbol for the material tenderness and the paternal strictness of this wonderful world. The ways of God become the subject matter of physics. Matter, the principle of Genesis and the true arbiter of fortune, has often been one of the realities symbolized under the name of God, as truth has often been another, and nothing is more normal than the magnetism of surrounding substance, with its thousand assaults and its thousand responses, should exercise a sobering guidance over the human soul. As the mere rigidity and grimace of a stock or stone can bring primitive man to his knees, annihilating his waywardness by the relentless authority of its stark being, so the discovered march of nature in its treacherous fecundity can hypnotize the philosopher and cause him to disown as impious his hopeless private idealisms. It is now his only idealism to be humble, to be wise, to be content with his finitude. This form of religion is more materialistic than materialism, since it assigns to matter a dignity which no profane materialist would assign to it, that of having moral authority over the hearts of men. Yet in some measure, matter deserves respect even in the eyes of the Platonist, whose aspiration seems at first sight to be to escape from it. For goodness is a prerogative which matter may acquire, as it acquires beauty, in so far as it falls into living organisms and feeds their capacity for intuition and feeling with an abundance of kindred things. The avowed materialist also, who professes to be an intelligent animal, cannot but place a part of his happiness in his understanding of the world. It is easier to change one's pleasures than to change the nature of things. Why not adapt these passionate demands of ours, so vague and helpless beyond the circle of our domestic needs, to that larger economy by which we must live, if we are to live at all? The study of nature and the equalizing blows of experience tend to establish this sort of regenerate and disillusioned piety in the place of the arrogant idealisms of the will. Human utopias begin to seem childish in the face of the facts, and the facts in their labyrinthine order and polyglot fertility end by seeming glorious as well as inevitable. There are always compensations for the brave, even in death, and a part of the soul rejoices and becomes immortal in its sympathies when it countersigns the death warrant of all the other parts. This fundamental materialism in all human wisdom leaves the spirit perfectly free to exercise its originality in the sphere of poetry and feeling, but it shows that insofar as spirit takes the form of intelligence and of the love of truth, which is also an ideal passion of the soul, it must assume the presence of an alien universe and must humbly explore its ways, bowing to the strong wind of mutation, the better to endure and to profit by that prevailing stress. It was in the act of making this assumption that animal sensibility first became intelligence. In its further exploration, spirit discovers, as far as it is possible or needful, its urgent and compulsory objects, as well as the organs, ailing or healthful, which give it play. Finally, with this self-knowledge, spirit completes its round and renders its philosophy secure and its ambition spiritual, for it has now conceived how it came into existence and how it is the natural light by which existence, in its waking moments, understands itself.